So we're going to be using this wonderful book written by Bruce Tate called 7 Languages in 7 Weeks. And we're actually going to be doing it in 14 weeks because we're interleaving learning about the language and then implementing features related to that language. And the first language that we'll be diving into is Ruby. And so what about Ruby?
Ruby is a object-oriented, dynamically typed programming language with some functional capabilities. It can pass around blocks, which are like functions. And
Okay.
it is commonly used for web development because of a neat framework called Ruby on Rails.
Which we won't be specifically getting into.
Not even a little bit,
Okay.
but
All right, so the next language we're going to be getting in, so this is basically a list of 7 and we'll be doing it in some order. We're not sure what order, but the next one is IO.
yep.
And what's the deal with IO?
IO is also a dynamic object-oriented programming language, but the neat thing about it is that it has prototype-based object orientation, where instead of having inheritance, each object has a prototype object that
So
it
that
guesses.
basically means that you create an object and then make copies of it rather than saying, here's my canonical object, please make me one.
Right.
Yeah.
And the common language that people deal with that works this way is JavaScript.
Mm.
But like Lua, which is used for as an extension language, also works this way.
Okay, and we'll also be looking at Prolog. So we just talked about Prolog, and Prolog is this logic language where you essentially use it to solve constraint satisfaction problems. You have a bunch of constraints, describe it, and say go, and it either gives you an answer or says no, I couldn't solve it.
In some amount of time.
Right. Okay, and we'll also be looking at Erlang. So what's the deal with Erlang?
Erlang is a dynamic functional language, and Erlang is especially interesting for us because it's the first language that we'll be looking at where we have immutable data and immutable variables. In Erlang, you can't say a equals 4 and then say a equals 5 because the interpreter will just barf at you. And so we'll need to figure out how you can write programs with that constraint. That would be fun.
The cool thing about Erlang is it was designed by Ericsson to run telephone switching systems.
Yep.
But now people are using it for all sorts of things.
Right. And the reason people are using it is because it has a good concurrency story, but it also is a good example functional language.
So we'll also be looking at Haskell, which has the same property as Erlang in that you can't redefine stuff.
Right. Except Haskell has a very strict static type system, and that's a lot of fun. And we'll get to deal with that all semester, because that's what we're doing assignments in.
Haskell's sort of special in our course design in that that's the language we'll be using to build our various feature systems. So we'll be doing lots of Haskell actually.
Yep.
Yeah. So we'll also be looking at Scala. And what's the story with Scala?
Scala is a language for the Java virtual machine that lets you write programs in a more functional style than Java lets you write. And it has a type system inspired by Haskell, but not quite as strictly static as Haskell's type system is. So it's a good sort of compromise language where we'll get to see how all the different pieces from the other languages fit together a bit.
Very nice. And the last of the 7 languages is Clojure. And what's the story? It's spelled like that, and you pronounce it Clojure.
Yep.
And what's the deal with Clojure?
Clojure is a Lisp, and that's important because Lisps have macros. And we'll spend a whole week explaining what that means, so that's a lot of fun. It's also a language that runs on the JVM, and again, it has its own unique concurrency story.